Are you over having Christmas roast and would prefer to Kerberoast? If so, Objective A is the go for you. This isn't for the faint of heart though. At 5 red Christmas tree difficulty, you're gonna spend a while to complete it. Overall, it took me about 5 hours in total to complete, albeit a bunch of time was spent on a broken system which couldn't actually be solved. Someone had, I guess, broken the permissions required to solve it. They must have hacked in and secured the DC, so props to them, but it doesn't help us. Eventually the box was restored and I was able to solve the challenge. It involves breaking out of a restricted SSH shell, finding internal hosts and open ports, retrieving a service principal name for an ELF service account, and requesting a Kerberoast service ticket for this account SPN. After we get the Kerberoast ticket granting service hash, which has been encrypted with an NTLM password hash for the ELF service account, it's something that we can crack. Using the tool Kill, we get a word list generated from the ELF registration page, which we're able to use to crack the retrieve TGS hash with HashCat, so long as we pair it with something like the one rule to rule them all permutation rule. Using the service account and password that we now have, we have to connect to a share located at 172.17.03 ELF service share to retrieve a script that has a hard-coded secure string in it for a PowerShell connection to a host at 10.128.1.53 as the user remote ELF. We can use the same PowerShell script in PowerShell for Linux to connect to this particular DC using those credentials that we don't actually know. From here, we have to enumerate the permissions on 80 objects, and we find we have WriteDACL Permissions to the research department object. This is a particular group that we want to get access to. Granting us generic all permissions, we are able to access the research department group and add ourselves to it, because we're going to do this with the credentials that we originally got registering for the particular service to begin with. Using this access, we connect to the research department share and exfiltrate a PDF that contains the answer to this challenge. I know that's a lot to take in, but let's run through it. We begin by registering on the ELF University page. This gives us SSH credentials to a grading system. I can't really do much on it, and Control-C doesn't really work, and so I attempted to break into some sort of proper unrestricted SSH shell, I should say. And there was a fair amount of Googling to find restricted shell escapes and trying them. At one point I even tried to use Netcat to connect to the SSH service and also try to specify not using a particular shell allocated in our profile with SSH by using the tack T parameter, but it didn't work. I was not having any luck. Based on what I was seeing, I began to think this may be a custom Python shell that I'd landed in, and it went on for about half an hour until I Googled quite literally escape Python shell. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Yeah. Oh, the first thing with the Google. I recommend you exit the Python interpreter with Control-D. This is the old ASCII code for the end of file or end of transmission. So I did Control-D and it went, yeah, no worries. That's what I Googled. Escape Python shell. The first result from Stack Overflow gave me the goods, and using my skills of reading a website description, I didn't even have to open the website. Hackerman. I went ahead and used the lead hacker keys Control+D and I broke out of the shell. To give you an idea of how close I was in the beginning, I was hitting Control+C. Now look at your keyboard. Look at where the keys are. I could have literally slipped on a key or hit the wrong key and I would have been successful here. This would have saved me half an hour. Hindsight is a beautiful thing. Alright, so from here I could use os.system with bin bash as my particular parameter that I was passing to it, and that will break us out into a bash shell. I was able to use ifconfig to find out what IP range I was on, and then I set the default SSH shell using chsh, which is change shell command, so that I could directly SSH to bin bash and not have to break out of this again. Luckily, this box had Nmap, so I used Nmap on the IP range with a 24 subnet in order to enumerate hosts and their open ports. I began attempting to enumerate network shares using a blog post I previously created as a reference guide. This was a hack the box challenge called Active, but yeah, I wasn't successful. I also tried to clone Kerberoast tools directly onto the system and install them, but I wasn't able to get that outbound connection. Eventually, I used Nmap to enumerate shares by specifying tack script equals smb tack enum tack users.nsc, and I did this on the 172.17.03 IP address, as it seemed like a juicy target with both ports 139 and 445 open used by SSB. I revealed a Elfu service share and a research department share, both of which will be needed later on in this challenge. I searched through shares to try and find any credentials stored in clear text or any group policy files that may have the credentials in them, but I wasn't successful in this. I even began to use a SANS post on plundering account information via authenticated SMB sessions as a way to get more information using RPCClient, but it wasn't of much value in the long run. Eventually, I resolved to using Impacket's getUserSPN's Python script to automate the Kerberoast and retrieve a hash for cracking. I wasn't directly able to clone it to the host though, so I wound up downloading it and using SCP to copy it to the box using our credentials, and you guessed it, your main guy Jai forgot the syntax, or never learnt it. Either way, it's off to Google, and I go to try and learn how to use SCP to copy a file to this system. That's not what I wanted. How do I... One of these should specify the port. It's a capital P I need. Need this earlier in the command line. There we go, except we haven't put our username. We don't want to log in as root because that's not going to work. So we should actually be able to put it in here. So if we do a username as this, that. It's now asking us for our password. Should be able to specify our password. And that should allow us to copy Impacket onto the box. Eventually, I run the tool and perform a successful Kerberoast to get the hash, which just now needs to be cracked. I used kill to get a word list from register.elfu.org. I was trying to grab this from the insecure HTTP version of the site. Plot twist, that doesn't exist. And I eventually realized this needs to be HTTPS for the secure site, which did exist. Managed to get the word list. It wouldn't be for another 5 minutes or so until I realized that I needed to use the tack with tack numbers parameter to ensure that this created a sufficient word list with the numbers that had to be used for cracking. I also forgot the parameters for cracking this type of hash once I had it, so I went back to my previous active blog post and found what I needed. I then needed to remember how to use a rule with this, and I wound up on the HashCat wiki anyway. Running it in my VM, I wasn't sure if I'd failed due to lack of GPU support or because I was stupid. Turns out I was probably just stupid. But I moved over to a cracking rig with some GPU support to perform this anyway. The cracking worked once I had an adequate word list and used that tack numbers parameter. I used the one rule to rule them all permutation rule for cracking because without this I wasn't able to get the password. The password was Snow2021 with an exclamation mark at the end, and using SmbClient with this account, I was then able to access the ELF service share previously enumerated. After getting on this share, I started to view the files in it to try to get passwords. I wanted to grab all the files, but kept getting prompted asking if I wanted to confirm my download after each particular file. I was rapidly hitting Y to confirm, and then I recursively grepped for the term password. I went down a rabbit hole here, seeing reference to password but with no credentials, and thought I missed a file. So I wound up Googling how to find out how you can use Mget without confirmation prompts. Yes, I should have done that to begin with, but you'll know I'm stupid. Turns out you could just need to run the prompt command. Cool beans, Jai. This isn't the first time you mess up something simple. Remember the makefile instance, or more recently SCP? What about HashCat and find commands? Okay, so we've established I don't remember the command line parameters for every single tool. Grabbing all the files, again, I found a lab config file with reference to lab admin and ls1 setup. That was the password there. Turns out that this was a red herring, and I fell for it. Well played, KringleCon. You got me again. After pulling myself out of this hole, I realized my grep commands were case sensitive, and I needed to use the tack if parameter to make it search properly. Doing the typing thing on the keyboard is hard. I went down a rabbit hole of trying PSExec, SmbExec, and WMIExec on one of these servers, but I didn't have write permissions to the share, so that was a bust. None of them would work. I took a look at the scripts again and found reference this time to get process info.ps1. This had a secure string password variable and reference to convert to secure string before being used with the PS credential PowerShell class to authenticate to a server. I tried to go backwards from converting it to secure string to get the original password, and I tried an online cracking tool. But this was, you guessed it, a bust. I wound up watching Chris Davis's presentation demonstrating Active Directory penetration testing to get some more ideas. Pondering around until I finally thought about reusing the PowerShell script to connect to the server. The only issue is that this is a Linux system that I was on. You see the issue here? You see where Jai did a stupid again? See where that brain didn't fire on all neurons? Yes, so I completely forgot that Linux could run PowerShell also. And so I ran which PowerShell and found out the box had PowerShell. Then I forgot what the Enter-PSSession syntax was, but after that I was able to get on this DC, which was sort of hidden away on another network at 10.128.153, and I managed to log on as remote elf. Yes, and we've done it. We've entered a remote PowerShell session on this particular domain controller using those credentials that we found in the script on an open share that we enumerated. Life's good. This server itself was configured to not respond to ICMP packets, and so pinging it wasn't a value, nor was a standard Nmap scan without setting it to ignore the ping responses. Once here, I wasn't sure if I needed to Kerberoast again, but I realized I couldn't get a connection out to download from GitHub or invoke through PowerShell. I didn't want to run the Sharphound collector and then take that back to my own machine, mostly out of laziness because I didn't have Bloodhound installed and would have to set that up. So if I could do it another way that didn't need that, then fantastic. On the topic of Bloodhound, aren't we all glad it uses Neo4j instead of Log4j? Too soon? Because I was stuck, I resolved to at least try using Sharphound by copying in the invoke Sharphound script. Yeah, this broke my session and crashed it completely because it's a very big script that basically just embeds a base64 encoded sharphound.exe binary that then runs. So yeah, it didn't work. Once recovered from that crashed session, I was at a point where I was stuck for a solid 45 minutes or so. I tried different variants of Chris Davis's scripts and snippets designed to try and find vulnerable ACLs I could abuse, but I didn't really get anywhere. I'm fairly confident at this point a lot of my issues stem from the box being broken, or should I say fixed, by some sort of security-conscious hacker. It reminded me of the incidents where vulnerabilities were being exploited and then the operators would fix the vulnerability so no one else could exploit it and get in. Or when a Mget malware operation was hacked to show memes to victims. Honestly, that's kind of funny and interesting, especially when Hackerman and James Franco start showing up where malware is meant to be served from. Google it. If you don't know it, Google it. The next day I tried again and the permissions issue seemed to be resolved. As remote elf, I had WriteDACL Permissions on the research department object. I should mention this was all gathered using Chris Davis's PowerShell snippets, and he does some great work. And he has done some great work over the KringleCon years that I've been doing this, including the TensorFlow image recognition challenge back in KringleCon 2. So check out his GitHub repository for some cool things. With WriteDACL permissions on the research department object, this was used to grant generic all permissions to our user account. Finally, with generic all rights, I was able to grant myself as a member to the research department group. And at this point, I forgot the name of the research department share we had enumerated. So I had to enumerate that once again. From here, I managed to access the research department share using my current user account and exfiltrate the Santa's secret to a wonderful holiday season PDF file. At this point, I encountered my arch nemesis SCP. I had to Google the syntax to copy this from the system back to my own system so the PDF could be read. Honestly, at this point you'd think I'd remember some of this stuff, but nah, I definitely don't. Reading the PDF, I see the first secret ingredient to consider for a wonderful holiday season is kindness. Logging back into KringleCon, the system got confused at where I was at because I hadn't been on it for so long, and I guess I was logging into it from a different session, being in my VM, and it decided to tell us that we'd completed 210% of the story. Honestly, for someone who still had one challenge to go, this was a pretty good achievement. Putting in kindness, I finally complete the first 5-tree difficulty challenge, and Objective 8 is a wrap. I feel like there's a joke somewhere here around Objective 8 being wrapped in Christmas presents, but honestly, I need a nap.